is a momentous day for our office, the Governor's Office of Strategic Planning and Budgeting. My name is Matt Gress, and I'm the Director of OSPB. And today we're going to present to you the fiscal year 2020 executive budget and some key highlights about that. 1.3 million Arizonans cast their vote on November 6th. 56% of the votes cast for Governor Ducey, re-electing him to a new 4-year term. And they made two priorities crystal clear. First, they want their teachers paid, and second, they want their budgets balanced, and this executive budget does exactly that. So over the next hour, we'll provide you an overview of the national and state economies and our view of the general fund revenues as a result. Then we'll move on to fiscal year 2019 supplemental funding, and then head on into the 2020 spending priorities of the governor. So with that, I'm going to introduce to you Glenn Farley.
Thanks, Matt. I'm Glenn Farley. I'm the Chief Economist for the Governor's Office of Strategic Planning and Budgeting, and I'll talk a little bit to you about how we came up with the revenue forecast that underpins the executive budget priorities. There are three things we like to look at when we're constructing the forecast every year. The first of those things is the pace and direction of the national economy. Then we'll look at the pace and direction of the state economy and how we sort of compare to that national average. And finally, we'll look at actual revenue growth and how that's performing, what that tells us about the future. Starting that conversation and looking at the national economy, in 2018, following years of slow post-recession growth, we finally achieved 3% real GDP year-over-year growth according to current projections. At the same time, the national labor market is the healthiest it has been in decades, with the unemployment rate at 50-year lows. Despite that tight unemployment rate, in December, we posted 300,000 national jobs gained, blowing away projections, coupled with 3.2% year-over-year wage growth. That tells us that despite that tightness, we're still growing and growing faster than people could have possibly anticipated. We think that extremely rapid growth in 2018 provides a good, strong explanation for why state revenue growth was so robust in the past 12 to 18 months or so. On the other hand, with a return to the growth past, the growth stories of the past, 3% plus, that means we have to consider the possibility of a return to slower growth thereafter. So post-recession, slow but steady, traditional economic cycles, fast expansion, followed by shorter periods of slower growth. We do think there is some evidence that in 2019, things will slow down a bit relative to 2018. Two indicators we track that tell us that are first, the pace of interest rate hikes by the Federal Reserve Board. Interest rate hikes tend to occur at economic maxima. There were 4 last year. The last time we had 4 hikes was 2006, another near economic peak. And interest rate hikes by design are intended to slow down the national economy, so we shouldn't be surprised that following those 4 hikes, there will be a slowdown. At the same time, in the back half of 2018, in the blue line, you can see there was a decline, a trend to bearish trends in national equity markets. That's sort of investors saying, hey, we're looking forward, and now we think the prospects for business growth in the future are slower today than they were perhaps 6 or 12 months earlier. So as we look at both of those things, we start to think 2018 was great, but maybe 2019 is going to be less great. But we really want to temper that expectation. There's been a lot of talk in the media and a lot of change in the tone of discussion about the economy, from really optimistic 6 or 12 months ago to really kind of pessimistic today. And we don't think the data supports that kind of pessimism. This isn't a call for a recession or anything like that. This is just a statement that we grew at 3%, which is great. We're not going to grow at 3% in 2019. Not the same thing as we're going to have negative growth or recession or anything like that. And we think that view is a view shared by most professional national economic forecasts. For example, on this chart, you can see the projections by the Federal Reserve Board from September in orange, updated to blue in November. While the projections in November are clearly slower and more conservative than the projections from September, they don't look like a recession scenario. It's still a growth economy at the national level. As recently as January 10th of this year, Chairman President Jerome Powell said no signs of recession in 2019. That's a perspective that we share. So growth is slowing, but it's not a cause for panic or anything like that. In terms of what that means for the state of Arizona, we believe that Arizona is well positioned to weather any changes in the national growth story. There's a couple of reasons we think that. First, Arizona is ranked first in the country for construction job growth and second in the country for manufacturing job growth in current data. These are leading base labor industries. You wouldn't expect employers to be expanding their construction payrolls if they thought the state was going to grow slower tomorrow than it's growing today. Instead, you'd expect them to be investing in labor sectors that exploit existing resources rather than construct new resources. So we think that means we're well positioned to continue growing faster than the country as a whole in the future. Similarly, we rank third in the country for the rate of net in-migration. When people move, they do so voluntarily, and they're forward-looking, right? They're saying, where can I go to do better than where I am today? And 47 out of 50 cases at least, they think Arizona is better than elsewhere, meaning that Arizona should grow faster in the medium term than the nation as a whole. In fact, even as we talk about this sort of slowdown at the national level, we're seeing the possibility of an acceleration, opposite of a slowdown, at the state level. In November, for the fourth month in a row, Arizona's total employment growth beat 3%. I can tell you based on preliminary data, we're going to add a fifth consecutive month to that with the December numbers, meaning for the first time in over a decade, Arizona's employment market is expanding at least 3%, if not faster. Extremely good sign for general fund revenue growth and for the state as a whole, assuming we can sustain it. To go into a little more detail about the state's labor market, in blue you can see the unemployment rate, which is tracking at 10-year lows. In orange, you can see total employment in the state, which is tracking at all-time highs. You'll see that in the past 6 months to a year, the unemployment rate is sort of leveled out in that 4 to 4.5% range. We don't think that's a bad thing. In fact, we think it's healthy for this phase of Arizona's economy. The reason for that is the orange bar. Not only are we still adding jobs, we're actually adding jobs faster today than we were previously, as I mentioned on the prior slide. So what's happening to hold that unemployment rate steady is more people are entering the state's labor force that are finding jobs or exiting that labor force. That's good, that's healthy, that means we're going to continue growing for at least the next couple of months or years. On the other hand, as the economy matures, we are expecting that unemployment rate to continue to fall. There are some forecasters that are projecting it'll be in the 2.5% to 3% range in the next 12 to 18 months. The final piece that we look at is the pace of general fund revenues in the recent past and year to date. Most of you might recall that there was considerable discussion last year about sort of the feasibility or achievability of the 2019 enacted budget forecast. Fortunately, in 2018, we easily exceeded those enacted targets with posting a 7.2% year-over-year growth rate. And year to date in fiscal year 2019, at least through November, we're up about 9.5%, and according to JLBC, about $175 million above that enacted budget forecast. So far, not only are we meeting the enacted targets, we're beating those enacted targets. We don't necessarily think it's realistic to enact a budget that projects 9.5% or even 7.5% growth going forward, but we think this is solid data that supports the case for increasing the forecasts. And in terms of what those increases looks like, the blue bars represent the 2019 enacted budget forecast for fiscals 18 through 21. The orange bars represent the executive increases contemplated in the 2020 budget. Following 7.1% year-over-year growth that I mentioned last year, the executive is now forecasting 6.8% year-over-year growth in fiscal 19. This compares to a 5.7% enacted growth rate contemplated in the 2019 budget and creates about $400 million in new capacity. That growth slows, consistent with the story I talked about at the beginning of this presentation, to 3.3% in fiscal year 2020, which is below the 4.2% growth rate in the enacted budget. But because of the larger 18 and 19 bases, we've still got $300 million more in 20 than were contemplated 6 months ago. That slowdown continues into 21 at 3.1% before we pick up again and accelerate to more normal levels in the out years. Combining those revised executive growth forecasts with our baseline spending assumptions, the executive anticipates that it will have approximately $1.1 billion in cash capacity in fiscal year 2020, a significant amount of resources, the most we've had in probably 10 years or longer. However, there is an interesting phenomenon that you'll see reflected in those structural balances. Unlike a more typical budget year where you'd expect structural balances to be higher in the future than they are today, they actually fall from $572 million in fiscal year 2019 to $334 million in fiscal year 21. Significant numbers to be sure, but decreasing. That reflects the large baseline spending commitments that were made in the 20 by 2020 plan last year. We phased those in through 21, creating those contracting structural capacities. What that means is the executive budget is going to have a real focus on one-time spending initiatives, reflecting that large cash capacity, but tighter structural constraints. And while it's true that focus on one-time initiatives is partly a reflection of fiscal reality, it's also partly a reflection of the governor's sort of fiscal philosophy. Specifically, the governor has no interest in repeating the mistakes of the past. And by that I mean, in the 5 years prior to the Great Recession, the general fund also enjoyed unexpectedly fast revenue growth. As a response, policymakers allowed general fund spending to grow by about 11% per year, average over those 5 years. And most of that spending was ongoing in nature. That meant when the revenues evaporated during the Great Recession, there was no flexibility for the general fund to rapidly respond, and it created sort of a catastrophic fiscal condition for the state. It took us 10 years to correct that fiscal condition. On the other hand, the governor has constrained average annual spending growth in his first 5 budgets to about 4.5% per year. And while it is true that in fiscal 20, the growth rate is higher than that, most of that spending, as we'll talk about here very shortly, is going to be one-time in nature or reflect a commitment to savings in nature, making us more prepared to flexibly respond to any issues that could crop up in the future. And on that note, I'm going to turn it over to Christina, who's going to talk about our rainy day fund deposit.
Thank you, Glenn. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Christina Dunyong, and I am a budget analyst at OSPB. As Glenn mentioned, of our approximately $1 billion in spending capacity, the executive budget allocates about half of that for a rainy day. This is the single largest line item in the executive budget, and it is one-time in nature. Financial experts say Arizona's current reserves are not enough to weather the next recession. This chart shows state reserves as a % of general fund revenues. The blue line shows actual reserves, and the orange line shows Moody's Analytics recommended reserve amounts. Historical precedent and the current statutory cap suggest that 7% of general fund revenues should be deposited in the state's rainy day fund. However, the Great Recession exposed the inadequacy of the traditional and recommended 7%, which has led experts to say that, in fact, 10% or more of general fund revenues should be reserved for times of economic hardship. This is why the executive budget includes a deposit of $542 million of general fund revenues into the rainy day fund. This is the largest single deposit ever made in the history of the fund. In addition, this deposit brings the fund balance to $1 billion, or 9% of general fund revenues. This is the highest level ever recorded. Additionally, the executive budget permanently raises the formula cap of general fund revenues as a portion of reserves from 7% to 10%, bringing it in line with current recommendations. Together, these initiatives secure Arizona's fiscal future. When the next economic downturn occurs, the state will have a more solid fiscal foundation and will be in a position to recover more quickly. In 2010, the state issued $1.4 billion in debt against its building assets to help address significant general fund operating deficits in the midst of the Great Recession. Since then, the state has paid off $474 million, leaving an outstanding balance of $950 million. Because the state's fiscal position and creditworthiness have improved greatly, the executive is refinancing this recession-era debt, saving taxpayers over $100 million between fiscal year 2020 and fiscal year 2030. Additionally, by paying off more than $400 million against the original debt, the state will be able to free 9 public buildings from the collateral package, including the Executive Tower, the House, the Senate, and the Supreme Court. Effectively, we have paid off our mortgage on these important public assets. Now to talk about how the executive plans to spend the remaining $500 million, including fiscal 2019 supplementals, I will hand it over to Elise.
Thank you, Christina. My name is Elise Kulik, and I'll be talking about the supplemental funding for fiscal year 19 and an overview of the executive spending initiatives for fiscal year 2020. First, to close out the current fiscal year, the executive budget provides $55 million in supplemental funding from the general fund to support the agencies in this chart. $25 million of this supplemental funding is dedicated to the School Facilities Board to fund an increase in building renewal grant projects. In prior years, increases in these grant applications have caused the board to carry forward liabilities from project commitments into the next fiscal year. This funding closes that gap, providing supplemental dollars in 19 to eliminate the liability from existing projects. In addition, the executive provides $10 million to the state universities, which fully covers insurance premium increases to the Health Insurance Trust Fund. This frees up university tuition dollars that have historically been used to pay down premium increases for other operational purposes. The executive also includes $5 million for agriculture infrastructure projects, which will be discussed later in this presentation. Moving on to fiscal year 2020, we'll discuss an overview of executive initiatives spending broken down by subject area, along with the state's structural and cash balances through fiscal year 2022. As Glenn mentioned, the executive projects an ending cash balance of $1.1 billion in fiscal 20 prior to the executive's initiative spending. This billion-dollar figure already accounts for prior baseline spending commitments from last year's budget, including the 20 by 2020 teacher pay increases. Half of that balance will be saved in the state's rainy day fund, and the other half will be devoted to executive priorities, which include targeted investments in the Arizona Teachers Academy, in public safety compensation, and in the drought contingency plan. All of these initiatives will be discussed later in the presentation. Of these investments, note that $320 million are one-time, and the remaining $218 million are ongoing spending. These two pie charts break down the spending by category. The chart on the left is initiative spending only, and the chart on the right includes initiative and baseline spending. Note that half of all new initiative spending is devoted to K-12 and higher education, and that number jumps to 70% of all spending when baseline figures are factored in. Moving on to the state's structural and cash balances, this graph depicts the state general fund revenues and spending from fiscal year 18 through fiscal year 22. The bars in solid blue represent ongoing revenues, and the bars in solid orange represent ongoing spending. The dashed blue and dashed orange lines represent one-time revenues and one-time spending, respectively. As Glenn mentioned, the executive forecasts healthy revenue growth through fiscal year 2022, as seen by the increase in the blue bars. The numbers below the graph reflect ending cash and structural balances each fiscal year. By the end of fiscal year 2019, the state will have observed the longest cash and structural balances since the Great Recession. In fiscal 20, the deposit in the Budget Stabilization Fund, along with other initiatives, combined to create the $109 million cash balance at the end of the year. This cash balance then decreases in fiscal year 2021 due to the final year of the 3-year phase-in for teacher pay. Cash and structural balances will grow normally afterward. Also below the graph, we see that the executive forecasts both a cash and a structural balance each year within the 3-year budgeting window. That structural balance never falls below $100 million during that time frame. Now, Jacob, Seth, and Sarah will be up here to discuss government that works.
The executive budget exhibits hallmarks of responsible government by driving efficiencies, expanding opportunities for business, and enhancing and securing public assets. The state of Arizona owns and operates more than 5,700 facilities, which are used to conduct operations, serve Arizonans, and improve public safety. Each year, the executive evaluates needs for repairs or upgrades to these facilities, as well as opportunities to improve government services through new construction. The executive budget invests $56 million in capital projects and building renewal, including upgrading transportation maintenance facilities, building a new public safety radio communications tower, and replacing public safety remote housing units. Another important asset is the state's workforce. The state offers excellent employee health insurance benefits to recruit and retain top talent. These self-insured benefits are underwritten by the Health Insurance Trust Fund, which in recent years has experienced a declining cash balance, as shown by the black line on this chart. The decline is due to a structural deficit seen in the years when expenditures, shown in orange, outpace revenues, shown in blue. If no action is taken, the fund is projected to run out of money in the coming fiscal year. To address this concern, the executive budget includes a one-time increase in premiums paid by state agencies on behalf of their employees. This increase will generate an additional $89 million, reflected in the difference between the red line and the green line here. This improves the fiscal year 2020 projected ending balance to $50 million. This short-term revenue solution allows the state to maintain high-quality benefits while continuing to explore long-term options to make the fund financially sustainable. As we will discuss later in this presentation, the expected cost increase for the state's universities will be covered by $30 million from the general fund. This holds the universities financially harmless from this change, consistent with the fiscal year 19 supplemental funding Elise described earlier.
Hi, I'm Seth Walter, budget analyst for OSPB, and I'll be talking about transportation spending. As a result of implementing the public safety fee, the executive budget is able to accelerate and expand critical transportation infrastructure projects. By no longer diverting money away from transportation infrastructure, to fund our highway patrol, we can now invest in projects that will ease congestion and improve highway safety. The I-17 expansion is one of these projects. The executive includes $130 million needed to alleviate the project's anticipated funding shortfall. Between fiscal years 2020 and 2022, this funding will accelerate and expand construction of the third highway lane on north and southbound segments of I-17 between Anthem and Black Canyon City. This investment is in addition to the State Transportation Board's $193 million to design and construct the I-17 expansion that's already in progress. Completing this project years ahead of schedule will provide Arizonans with safe and efficient roads on this vital transportation corridor. In addition to dedicating money to building new roads, the executive budget also focuses on properly maintaining infrastructure that we already have. Another project made possible by the public safety fee is fully funding our road maintenance. This initiative completes the journey that we began last year, where state road maintenance budget was increased from 29% to 79% of need. Fiscal 2020 finishes the job by increasing budget by almost $11 million to a total of $51 million, so that we can fully fund preventative road maintenance. This makes good on the governor's commitment to good government, because for every dollar that we spend on road maintenance, we save $6 in costs associated with rebuilding crumbling infrastructure and unsafe roads. By maximizing the lifespan of our roads, we keep the economy moving. However, transportation infrastructure is not the only way the executive budget is paving the way for a bright future. In fiscal year 2020, the executive budget also includes critical investments in our state's digital highway infrastructure. As Arizonans who live in rural areas know, rural internet connectivity is far behind the rest of the state. According to the federal communications data, 825,000 Arizonans do not have opportunities to subscribe to high-speed internet access. And only 10.6 can subscribe to super-fast gigabit internet, critical for 21st century jobs. As you can see, Arizona also lags behind our neighbors to the north and west when it comes to this high-speed internet access. The executive budget restores $7 million in funding for grants that attract, expand, and retain Arizona enterprises in fiscal 2020. $3 million of these monies will be dedicated to establishing a competitive rural broadband development grant program, which will provide critical funding for local projects across the state to develop high-speed internet infrastructure. Without increasing its appropriation, the Arizona Commerce Authority will be hiring and housing a brand new state broadband director, creating a single point of contact for state broadband strategy.
Hello, I'm Sarah Bingham, and I'm also a budget analyst, and I will be discussing several initiatives to assist Arizona counties, as well as another initiative designed to increase produce imports. The fiscal 2019 budget included multiple initiatives aimed at restoring funding to county budgets. The table on this slide highlights key initiatives included in the fiscal 2019 budget and the fiscal 2020 executive budget that impact county funding. The fiscal 2020 executive budget continues the trend of eliminating county cost shifts by repealing 2 sections of state law that require counties to annually contribute $11.2 $1.2 million towards the operating costs of the Department of Juvenile Corrections. The elimination of the juvenile corrections cost sharing, combined with other funding included in the fiscal 2020 executive budget, will result in counties receiving an additional $19 million in ongoing cost reductions in fiscal 2020. The Mariposa point of entry in Nogales is one of the largest ports of entry for fresh produce originating from Mexico. Currently, the port lacks the adequate cold room storage to accommodate the inspection of many temperature-sensitive products, including berries, avocados, seafood, and some pharmaceuticals. Historically, Nogales has been the port with the highest annual value of fruit imports. But as you can see in this chart, Nogales is now third and was surpassed as the top port in the mid-2000s, partly due to a lack of refrigeration capacity. To address this problem, the executive budget includes $700,000 to build a cold room within an existing federal inspection facility, with local partners also contributing $300,000. Once completed, this facility will help Arizona compete with other border states as carriers decide where to transport their temperature-sensitive cargo. A recent University of Arizona study projects the new economic activity associated with the increased imports would lead to an estimated annual increase of 27 to 30 million in gross state product and 3.7 to 4.1 million in additional state and local tax revenues. Next, Sarah, Kwesi, and Brett will be discussing education.
Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Giles, and I'm a budget analyst with OSPB. Along with my colleagues Brett and Kwesi, we will be discussing some of the highlights from the 2020 executive budget related to education. The executive budget prioritizes education. As Elise mentioned earlier, 50% of all governor initiatives and 70% of all new spending in FY2020 is dedicated to K-12 and higher ed. 63% of the new funding is for K-12. $637 million. The majority of that will be used to fund the next round of the teacher pay package. Another large portion will support basic state aid to account for a 0.8% enrollment growth increase and a 2% inflation adjustment. There's also a significant amount of money for school facilities. The other initiatives on this graph I will discuss in greater detail in later slides. The executive budget also includes $104 million, or 7% of all new funding in fiscal year 2020 for higher education. In addition to the $30 million that Jacob referenced earlier to hold universities financially harmless for the HITIF increase, there's also money for capital and operational expenditures, as well as expanding the success of the Teachers Academy. There's additional funding for career and technical education at community colleges. The executive budget delivers on the promise to increase resources for K-12 education by continuing implementation of the 20 by 2020 plan and continuing to phase in additional assistance. The fiscal year 2019 budget established a 5-year plan to restore $372 million suspended from basic state aid for additional assistance. Additional assistance is flexible funding that can be used outside of typical maintenance and operation costs on things like textbooks, curriculum, or technology. The fiscal year 2020 executive budget continues to implement the executive's plan to restore additional assistance funding by providing $68 million as the second installment of this 5-year plan. Additionally, the executive makes good on the promise to raise teacher pay by 20% by school year 2020, a total investment of $646 million in Arizona's teachers. The fiscal year 2020 budget includes an additional $165 million for teacher salaries in the baseline, which means that this funding is permanent and will be adjusted annually for inflation. At full implementation, the cumulative impact of these initiatives is over $1 billion in additional and permanent funding for education. An important component of the executive budget is expanding results-based funding. Results-based funding was first introduced in fiscal year 2018 to reward schools for high student achievement and to encourage replication and expansion of high-performing schools. In fiscal years 2018 and 2019, funding was distributed based on schools that scored in the top 10% of the statewide assessment AZ merit. As you can see on the graph, nearly 300 schools in each fiscal year received about $40 million. In fiscal year 2020, the executive will use the A through F letter grade system instead of AZ merit to distribute results-based funding. The letter grades include additional measures of school performance, such as student growth and college readiness, in addition to proficiency on the statewide assessment. Schools that receive an A letter grade will qualify for results-based funding under the current formula, but the executive goes a step further to expand the funding formula to include B schools that have 60% or higher free and reduced lunch participation. The executive provides a $60 million increase in funding to support this expansion, and an estimated 951 schools will receive nearly $100 million in additional financial support in fiscal year 2020. As mentioned in the State of the State, school safety initiatives are an executive priority. Governor Ducey released the Safe Arizona Schools Plan in March 2018, which called for making school safety a top priority by investing more in mental and behavioral health resources, as well as increasing the number of school resource officers on campus. As you can see in this graph, in the most recent grant cycle for school resource officers, 203 schools applied for funding, and only 114 received an officer due to limited funding availability. The executive budget provides $9 million to fund school resource officers at the remaining 89 schools. The executive budget also includes $6 million to establish a new school safety grant program that awards school counselors or social workers in a manner similar to the school resource officer grant program. The fiscal year 2021 budget will double funding for the grant program and further expand access to these critical resources. As a result of this investment, we estimate that school counselor caseloads could decrease by up to 17%. Another top priority is career and technical education. The executive budget includes $10 million to develop a career and technical education incentive program, further aligning Arizona's K-12 education with growing workforce needs. The Arizona Commerce Authority will identify critical industry sectors and certificates to be a part of this program. A $1,000 incentive payment per pupil will be provided to schools that graduate students with these approved credentials. Preliminarily, the ACA has identified the top in-demand sectors to include manufacturing, business and financial services, construction, and healthcare. As an example, students in the construction industry can earn certificates such as the Career Connection Certificate or the NCCER certificate, carpentry certificate. Because construction has been identified as a critical needs sector, schools that graduate students with these credentials would qualify for an incentive payment. Not only do the schools benefit, but students in these programs are equipped to be successful in the workforce, and they qualify for the nearly 2,400 job openings in the construction sector, which average over $20 an hour. The executive also focuses on increasing transparency and accountability for the state charter schools. The State Board for Charter Schools grants charter status and oversees over 500 charter schools statewide. Over 17% of Arizona students attend charter schools, and enrollment continues to grow. The executive budget provides $786,000 to hire 10 additional staff to conduct more frequent school site visits to address operational, academic, and financial performance. The board is currently finalizing their financial performance framework that will be used to determine a new intervention process for schools that do not meet financial performance standards, to include site visits and additional oversight of financial management practices. The additional staff will allow the board to increase the frequency of interval reviews that allow the board to identify operational, academic, or financial performance concerns. As a result of this investment, the board will be able to inspect an estimated 65% of all charter sites for operational, academic, and financial performance in fiscal year 2020, compared to an estimated 23% under current staffing levels. Next, Brett will discuss investments in the School Facilities Board.
Hello, my name is Brett Cloninger. As regards school facilities building renewal, as you can see how about we go to the chart? As you can see in the chart, school district building renewal requests have more than tripled since fiscal 2013. The executive believes that these school building renewal needs are driven in large part by aging school building systems. In the 6 years after the passage of Students First in 1998, the state completed $1.3 billion in emergency deficiency corrections projects, which were focused on bringing building systems up to square footage or structural quality standards. Additionally, during the same 1999 to 2004 time period, $934 million in new schools were completed. It's now 15, closing on 20 years later, and these school building systems, including expensive items such as roofs and HVAC systems, are aging, and many are now coming due for significant repair or replacement. As you can see in the graph, school district building renewal requests for fiscal 19, which is the red line, are approaching the fiscal 2019 appropriation, which is the flat gray bar at $51 million. To meet school district building renewal needs in fiscal 19, the executive adds $25 million as a current year supplemental appropriation, which Elise referred to earlier. This is reflected in the graph as the dotted line in the upper right. This brings the total fiscal 19 appropriation for school district building renewal to $76 million. To meet school district building renewal needs in fiscal 20, the executive budget includes $63 million over the baseline building renewal amount of $17 million, which represents a total $80 million recommendation for building renewal in fiscal 20. For new school construction, in fiscal 13, in the aftermath of the recession, the legislature changed the standards for constructing new schools from funding schools that were needed in 2 to 3 years to constructing them only if needed in the current year. Given the delay until the effective date of the appropriation and then a 2-year construction schedule, this means that overcapacity schools could have children in improvised space for as much as 3 years while the school is being appropriated and constructed. The executive budget returns to the pre-2013 standard for constructing new schools. Based on current estimates for out-year construction needs, the executive estimates that this one-time catch-up will be $99 million, which is on top of the current law need of $92 million. In total, the executive budget includes $191 million in fiscal 2020 for construction of new or expanded schools, as you can see on the slide. And the other thing, actually, you can't really see the shading on this slide, but the expanded schools are on the bottom half of the slide. Please note that using newer information, SFB staff will be updating cost estimates for the out-year schools in the next couple months, which may modify this list of schools. Next up is Kwesi, who will discuss higher education.
Good afternoon. My name is Kwesi Pasley, and I will present the higher education investments in the fiscal year 2020 executive budget. Arizona continues to experience a critical shortage of teachers, and that shortage is severe in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics subjects, as well as special education. To accelerate the teacher pipeline in Arizona, the executive budget includes $21 million to expand the Arizona Teachers Academy. In 2017, Governor Ducey, along with the state's 3 public universities, launched the academy to affect and retain the best students to become educators in the state. In fiscal year 2020, the academy will offer expanded eligibility to include not only education majors, but students majoring in STEM subjects. Furthermore, the Enhanced Academy provides 4 years of tuition benefits, incentivizes students to teach in a critical need area after graduation by offering them a $1,000 stipend while in school, and invites both non-resident and community college post-baccalaureate students to participate. Through this investment, more than 3,400 university students and 1,100 community college students are expected to be able to participate, resulting in an overall program capacity of 4,500 students. Community colleges in Arizona provide great opportunities to learn in-demand, high-need skills. The Aviation Technology program at Pima Community College is one of only 2 aviation technician training facilities in the state, with the program providing both full-time and dual enrollment students the opportunity to participate in the program. The executive budget includes a $20 million investment to double the student capacity to fill the labor demands in the region. In addition, the Maricopa County Community College District, MCCCD, offers a number of healthcare training facilities in Maricopa County, including the Center for Nursing Excellence at Phoenix College. The state's $5.8 million investment will allow for MCCCD to create training programs for 6 new specialty areas, including operating room, emergency care, telemetry, oncology, ICU, and home care specialists. With these areas to grow on average by 24%, according to the Bureau for Labor Statistics by 2024, this investment will ensure that enough healthcare professionals are being credentialed to meet the demands of this growing sector. The executive budget also includes $35 million for universities to address operations and maintenance costs associated with Arizona resident students, and also includes, as previously mentioned, $30 million to hold the universities harmless from future increases in the state's health insurance trust fund. While the state previously provided post-secondary educational benefits to Arizona National Guard members, these benefits were halted due to the Great Recession in 2011. Currently, Arizona is the only state in the nation that does not offer any form of tuition assistance to members of its National Guard. Continuing education is important for career advancement and promotion in all branches of the armed services. With this in mind, the executive budget includes $1 million for a National Guard tuition reimbursement program. I'll now welcome Brittany Cleveland and Marshall Pimentel to the podium to present the health and welfare section of the executive budget.
Good afternoon. My name is Brittany Cleveland, and I am an OSPB budget analyst. I will be discussing a few of the key health and welfare initiatives featured in this year's executive budget. The executive budget includes $2 million in fiscal year 20 and $9 million in fiscal year 21 to eliminate the Kids Care enrollment freeze. Kids Care is Arizona's Medicaid program that provides health insurance for over 32,000 Arizona children. The federal government currently covers 100% of the cost of the program. However, a 2017 law freezes enrollment if the federal match drops below 100%. This will occur at the end of September of this year, when the match rate drops to 90.5%. Without Kids Care, families may choose to forego medical care for their children, or in order to qualify for Medicaid, reduce their working hours or stop working altogether. In addition, without the repeal, approximately 25,700 children would lose coverage in fiscal year 2022, as shown by the blue line on the graph. Eliminating this freeze allows parents to remain in the workforce and pursue opportunities for advancement that can free them from the need of government assistance. In addition to securing health care for Arizona children, the executive budget also dedicates $56 million in federal funding for Arizona's Child Care Subsidy program. This program, operated by the Department of Economic Security, provides child care subsidies for low-income and foster parents. Currently, Arizona's rates are one of the lowest in the country, with an average reimbursement rate of $365 per month for low-income parents and $406 per month for foster parents. Parents must pay the difference between the child care subsidy and the actual cost of care, which can be very difficult for those working minimum wage jobs. Half of the funding will be dedicated to increasing the subsidy rate. Currently, the maximum rate in Maricopa County for an infant receiving full-time care is $576 per month, as shown by the graph. The red dot shows where Arizona's new maximum rate will be after the policy is implemented. This increase to $775 puts Arizona in line with our neighboring maximum rates. The executive budget allocates the other half of funding to expand the program to 5,000 additional children throughout fiscal year 2020 who are currently on the wait list for the program. Last, the executive budget allocates $11 million in federal funding for adult protective services and home and community-based services. Adult protective services provides case management for adults suffering from abuse. In recent years, reports of abuse and neglect have increased at a rate of 18% per year. In fiscal year 19, the executive used federal support to include more staff to meet caseload demands. In fiscal year 20, the executive continues utilizing federal funding for the projected fiscal year 20 caseload growth. In addition, the executive allocates new federal funding to address the backlog of individuals in need of home and community-based services. These services include adult daycare, home-delivered meals, transportation, and in-home nursing visits. The waitlist continues to grow in Maricopa County, with 1,270 seniors on the waitlist at the end of fiscal year 17, as shown by the blue line on the graph. Statewide, the waitlist is estimated to have 3,200 seniors waiting for these services. This commitment ensures that Arizona seniors are safe from abuse and are able to stay in their homes for as long as possible.
Thank you, Brittany. My name is Marshall Pimentel. I'll be finishing out the health and welfare section. The Department of Child Safety is in year 4 of a multi-year project to replace the Children's Information Library and Data Source System with a new Guardian Information Management System, which is expected to be completed in fiscal year 2021. The executive recommends additional funds for this transition, as the Guardian system will be a secure cloud-based system that employs mobile technology to assist with key agency functions, including intake processing, case management, provider management, and financial management. Next, the March of Dimes organization found that several areas in Arizona have a concerning lack of prenatal care resources, particularly in the state's rural areas. This puts women and their unborn children at a higher risk for complications during pregnancy and after birth. In order to better care for this vulnerable population, the executive recommends funding for telemedicine equipment to better serve expectant mothers. This funding will also be used to provide loan repayment services to those healthcare professionals which provide this vital service. And finally, as you can see from this chart, veteran suicides make up a larger portion of total suicides in Arizona in comparison to our neighbors or national rates. As this is a concern nationwide, federal legislation called the Clay Hunt Suicide Prevention Act was passed in 2015, which directed the VA to improve veteran access to mental health services. This manifested in Arizona's Be Connected program, which provides a 24/7 support call line, a resource matching tool, and training for community members who want to better assist veterans in need. Last year, over 2,000 individuals were served by Be Connected program providers. Therefore, this funding will ensure that this critical program continues to benefit Arizona's active military personnel, veterans, and their families. Next, we'll have Sarah present on the natural resources section.
Once again, I am Sarah Bingham, and I will be discussing funding for the Drought Contingency Plan. As the governor expressed in his State of the State, securing Arizona's water future is a top priority. Faced with a 19-year drought, Arizona, California, Nevada, and the Bureau of Reclamation have developed a lower basin drought contingency plan designed to protect the elevation of Lake Mead. The chart on this slide shows the anticipated effects of the drought contingency plan on Lake Mead elevations based on Arizona Department of Water Resources stress test hydrology projections. As you can see by looking at the orange line, the proposed plan will likely not prevent Tier 1 or Tier 2 shortages from happening, but offers a real possibility of keeping Lake Mead from falling to the critical elevation of 1,025 feet and provides more time for Arizona to prepare for a drier future. The current plan will require the compromise of all stakeholders. To support the implementation of the plan within Arizona, the executive budget includes $30 million for conservation efforts dedicated to protecting water levels in Lake Mead, an additional $5 million as a fiscal 2019 supplemental for agriculture infrastructure projects. These investments are in addition to the $6 million for conservation efforts appropriated between 2018 and 2020. Next, presenting on public safety will be Ryan, Yan, and Ben.
Good afternoon. My name is Ryan Vergara. I'm a senior budget analyst. Today I'm going to be providing a brief overview of some of the public safety initiatives included in the fiscal year 2020 executive budget. A cornerstone of the executive budget is a comprehensive public safety focused pay package that will provide salary increases to over 14,000 state employees. The vast majority of that money will go to public safety agencies that protect the lives of Arizonans on a daily basis. Since September, the executive has worked to identify key positions within specific agencies where an investment in increased salaries will result in a safer, more secure Arizona. The next few slides provide additional details on some of the salary increases included in this year's budget. The Department of Corrections currently needs 6,655 correctional officers to fully staff all posts within the state's prison system. As the chart on the slide indicates, in June of 2018, the department only had 5,702 correctional officers employed. The divergence of the two lines in this chart highlight the growing vacancy rate within the correctional officer position. The department has been able to maintain operations by utilizing increased overtime, but that is not a sustainable long-term solution, especially given the trend in rising vacancy rates over the last 7 years. In order to turn the tide on the rising vacancy rates, the executive budget includes $34 million to provide correctional officers with a 10% pay increase. Much like the Department of Corrections, the Department of Public Safety is constantly competing with local and federal agencies seeking to recruit and retain the most highly qualified individuals. As the table on the slide shows, currently the Department of Public Safety sits at the bottom of the list of entry officer salaries amongst the largest Arizona law enforcement agencies. The executive budget provides $18 million to the Department of Public Safety to fund a 10% increase for trooper salaries, allowing the department to better compete with these other agencies to recruit the best individuals for the job. The Department of Juvenile Corrections is similar to the Department of Corrections in many ways. Both agencies are tasked with providing a secure place to house inmates. Both agencies are tasked with transforming those inmates into productive members of society. And unfortunately, both agencies are experiencing similar difficulties with recruiting and retaining a large enough workforce. The slide here provides two examples of positions within the department that are experiencing these issues. The executive budget provides DJC with $3 million to allow the department to achieve two goals. First, salary schedules will be increased to match those at the Department of Corrections, so individuals performing similar duties between the two agencies will be compensated at similar rates. Secondly, this funding allows DJC to implement an 8-year step plan that will allow for annual raises for youth correctional officers, likely driving down the 100% turnover rate experienced in fiscal year 2018. Up next, Yan will discuss additional investments included in this year's budget.
Thank you, Ryan. My name is Yan Gao, and I'm a budget analyst at OSPB, and I'm here to discuss caseworker pay increase in the Department of Child Safety. The executive budget includes a $9 million of pay cap package for the Department of Child Safety for a 9% increase in caseworker pay. The Department of Child Safety has been consistently unable to meet the legislative benchmark of hiring and retaining 1,406 caseworkers. As you can see on the graph, the blue line represents the legislative benchmark, and the orange line represents the number of caseworkers DCS hires. DCS has, on average, been under the benchmark by 80 caseworkers, or about 6% vacancy rate. In fiscal year 2018, DCS reports a 35% caseworker turnover rate, with pay being the second biggest reason for caseworker leaving after not feeling recognized or valued. Furthermore, caseworker turnover also significantly impacts the likelihood of a child achieving permanency. These targeted increases can help allow caseworkers to have competitive salaries and drive down turnover rate and allow DCS to reach its legislative benchmark. Next, the executive budget includes $2 million for pay increase for substance abuse counselors and educational program teachers at the Department of Corrections. These positions provide educational, literacy, substance abuse services to inmates to help them get back on their feet post-release. Much like the correctional officers, these positions face high vacancy rates. The blue line on the graph shows the substance abuse counselors, and the vacancy rate has spiked to over 50% in fiscal year 2019. And the orange line shows the educational program teachers and the increase of vacancy rates over the past 4 years.
Filling these positions are important to continue the governor's initiative of reducing recidivism and helping inmates getting back to their feet. In 2017, Governor Ducey proposed a pre-workforce readiness program for inmates. With the collaboration of the Department of Corrections, the Department of Economic Security, the Governor's Office, and dozens of other stakeholders, over 2,000 inmates have completed the program in Lewis, Perryville, Tucson prison complexes. Nearly half of these inmates, or 986 of them, have secured employment post-release. The executive looks forward to continuing these efforts and also further build upon his commitment to reducing recidivism and creating a real second chance by establishing a prison coding program that will allow inmates to learn computer programming skills and the opportunity to work in Arizona's growing tech industry. Next, Ben will be talking about public safety investments.
All right, thanks, Ann. My name is Ben Blink, and I'm a senior public policy or a senior budget analyst here at OSPB. Let's see. For the Department of Public Safety, the executive budget makes investments in personnel and equipment to address the state's most critical public safety needs. I'll talk about 4 of them here. First, the budget includes $6 million for troopers, sergeants, and dispatchers for the new Loop 202 South Mountain Freeway. The 22 miles of new freeway is scheduled to open this November, and this investment will provide 24/7 coverage for that new road. Second, around-the-clock highway patrol coverage is critical, especially in southern Arizona. The executive budget includes $3 million for 11 troopers and 1 sergeant dedicated to overnight patrols in southern counties. This builds on the 12 troopers added in fiscal year 2017 and the 12 troopers added in fiscal year 2019, bringing the total investment to 36 new positions for Southern Border Patrol since fiscal year 2017. Third, we know that the overnight hours have some of our highest rates of impaired driving in Maricopa County specifically. The budget includes approximately $2 million for 6 trooper positions for overnight patrols specific to Maricopa. This adds to the 6 troopers added in fiscal year 19 for 12 total positions over the last 2 years. And fourth, the executive budget adds $1 million for replacement vehicles for sworn positions at DPS. Today, the department budget funds only about 58% of the total vehicle need for the department, and all of that funding is dedicated to highway patrol vehicles. This $1 million will be used to fund non-highway patrol vehicles, such as those used by the troopers in their criminal investigations division. Now, as you heard earlier, the state has been using transportation funding to pay for a large portion of our state's highway patrol. This diverts money away from our counties, from our cities, and from our state, who rely on those funds to build new roads and to improve existing roads. This year, the legislature enacted a public safety fee based on the highway patrol budget and the number of expected fee-paying vehicles that we expect to pay that year. The law specifies the fee should raise 110% of the state's highway patrol budget. So, the Department of Transportation set the fee based on a highway patrol budget of $168 million. So after adding the required 10%, the fee would raise $184.7 million in fiscal year 19 if it were collected for the entire year. We subtract from that a small amount of revenue from vehicles that are paying a $5 public safety fee. These are non-highway vehicles but still rely on public safety support, giving us a total revenue target of $184.2 million. We divide that by the total number of fee-paying transactions, I should say, for fiscal year 19, and we get our per vehicle cost of $32. This frees up transportation monies and other monies previously used for the highway patrol that are now available for critical purposes across the state. So, the key question is what happens to the amount of this fee if the highway patrol budget increases? So if the highway patrol budget increases at the same rate as the number of fee-paying vehicles from year to year, then we expect the fee to stay the same from one year to the next. This year, the executive budget makes several critical investments in the highway patrol. It adds about approximately $26 million to the highway patrol budget. So it's a high priority of the executive budget that the fee not increase in the first year as a result of these new expenditures. So therefore, in fiscal year 2020, we're going to be using general fund monies to cover a portion of those new highway patrol expenditures. And over the next 4 fiscal years, the new revenue that comes in as the state's number of transactions for the public safety fee increase will reduce that general fund amount. So as you can see here, In fiscal year 2019, we have our total number of transactions that we expect. That's by the blue bars. The orange bars show us the increase in the number of transactions. And in fiscal year 20, we expect about $6 million in revenue from those new public safety fee transactions. And we'll use about $19.7 million of the 26 total from the general fund. As the number of fee-paying transactions increase from year to year, our need for general fund monies will decrease. And by fiscal year 2023, all of that will be funded by the Highway Patrol, the public safety fee increases. So with that, I leave it to Matt Gress, our director, to wrap things up.
Thanks, Ben. So where does that end up after all of these executive initiatives are included? Well, we have $461 million in baseline changes, $538 million in new executive initiatives, of which a majority is one-time in nature, again, preserving the financial flexibility that our state needs to take on unexpected fiscal challenges in the out years, should they emerge, for a total spending package of about $11.4 billion. We also make a rainy day fund deposit of $542 million, and we have an ending balance in 2020 of $109 million, with a positive structural balance of $244 million. The governor said in his State of the State address on Monday that his budget will fully fund the priorities that we know are important, the things that matter: public safety, child safety, education above and beyond inflation. And in fact, we are making a historic investment into the state's rainy day fund, preserving Arizona's fiscal future, ready to take on whatever unexpected economic event might happen, so that we can recover faster, stronger than ever before. I'd like to thank all of my staff at OSPB for making this presentation, the governor's budget, a reality. They've spent numerous hours, a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, and I am meaning that in the literal sense, to get this budget over the line, and I'm so very grateful, and the governor is so very grateful for their work. Our budget is available online at azgovernor.gov as well as azospb.gov. And this live stream will be available through those websites as well. Over the next couple of weeks, we'll be traveling throughout the state of Arizona to Yuma, to Kingman, to Tucson, to Nogales, and to Casa Grande to share with them what we've included in this budget, because it's comprehensive and it affects all Arizonans, regardless of where they live. And those who are outside of the great state of Maricopa will certainly benefit from that. So at this point, as we've done in prior years, we take questions from the audience and questions online, if there are any. So is there anyone out in the audience that has a burning question for the governor's budget office? Yes, and if you can stand and state your name and your organization, and then I'll try to repeat your question, and we'll go from there.
Bonnie Diehl with the Arizona Council of Human Service Providers.
Okay.
We have historically seen a line item in the access budget for crisis services and for non-Title 19 behavioral health services, as well as broken out the behavioral health services. Are we going to see that in this budget from the governor?
So will we see continued support for behavioral health services, in particular in our crisis services special line item, and the other one was non-Title 19. These are individuals who don't qualify for Medicaid funding and that are state-only funding. And the answer is yes, we still maintain those commitments in the governor's budget. You'll find them in the access detail section in the executive budget. Thank you. Anybody else? All right, well, thank you very much for coming and being part of this special event. We've worked quite a long time to get here. Again, if you have any questions for us, please don't hesitate to ask. and have a great weekend. Thank you.